Hello, I'm Andrew Kamei-Deitch, and today on Pre-Modern Japan we're going to be talking about the struggle for unification at the end of the Sengoku period. Now, as the Sengoku period dragged on, some of the daimyo began to plan grand conquest campaigns. They were hoping to reunify Japan with themselves, naturally, at the top of the new order. But the unification of Japan was a slow process, and there was no one individual that could complete that process alone. So here we have just a breakdown of some of the famous daimyo territory in 1570. You can see that Japan is divided into various different power areas, and of course, as time went by, these daimyo struggled with each other and slowly tried to gain more and more power. Now, eventually, three people were to emerge who contributed directly to the reunification of the country, and these three were Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. So we're going to look at each of them in turn and the contributions that they made. So, first of all, Oda Nobunaga. Well, he was a very highly effective military and political leader. I think I mentioned him before in a previous lecture in that capacity. It's important to note that he wasn't just someone who was skilled as a military leader, he was also a skilled administrator and was good at land surveying. He recognized the importance of trade, both domestically and internationally. In fact, he built very good relations with the Jesuits when they first came into Japan to try to encourage the economic benefit that he could get from that trade relationship. As a result of this, in fact, he became so well known for his involvement with the Jesuits. The image of him that we have today in contemporary Japanese society is of someone who is sort of dabbles with westernization. He often shows up in anime or TV drama wearing Western clothes and drinking wine and talking about Western things. It's a bit of a funny stereotype, but of course that image that persists from the time shows us to what extent he was associated with the Westerners and trade with them, which he certainly did think was important. He also recognized the value of firearms, and in particular using firearms in battle in a mass formation. Now, some of Nobunaga's most famous battles, of course there were many, I'm only going to go through three here. Okehazama in 1560 is one of his most famous early achievements because it was a situation where his army was able to snatch victory from a much larger opponent. So he was fighting Imagawa Yoshimoto, who had an enormous army, something in the region of 25,000 men, and Oda Nobunaga only had around 2,500, so a tiny fraction of his opponent. However, he was able to use his strategic genius to gain victory over him. Imagawa was camped out in an area where his men were very confident, they were kind of celebrating, enjoying themselves, and very confidently looking ahead where Oda Nobunaga had left a small group of his men with all of their banners, essentially impersonating his main army, whereas he took his real main army back around through the forests and attacked Imagawa from the rear, and completely overran the camp before they realized what was happening. So, major strategic victory that showed how he was able to sort of use the land to his advantage. Another battle that he's particularly famous for is Nagashino in 1575. This conflict was where Nobunaga, and backed by Ieyasu and others, fought against Takeda Katsuyori. And this is an important battle in Japanese history because it clearly demonstrated the superiority of firearms over cavalry charges. So Takeda deployed a cavalry charge to try and break Oda Nobunaga's lines, but it failed miserably because of the ability of Oda Nobunaga's forces to deploy these rotating volleys of fire against the horses. And it showed that a cavalry charge was no match for a well-organized firearm position. So that's why that was a particularly important conflict. Finally, 1582, Honnoji. This is, of course, when Oda Nobunaga was betrayed by Akechi Mitsuhide. And he ended up having been wounded in the course of the struggle. Oda Nobunaga decided to commit suicide, we believe. Mitsuhide did not live long enough to enjoy his victory. He was hunted down and killed by Hideyoshi just 11 days later. Hideyoshi, of course, is someone who I will talk about in a moment, the second unifier. Now, just to give you some sense of Oda Nobunaga's achievements, here we have a map of Japan in the Azuchi Momoyama period, so in the middle of the Sengoku era. And what we find here is, if you have this little blot way over here, this purple section, that is the territory of Owari, which Oda Nobunaga inherited when he first became daimyo. And then he set out and gained all the rest of this purple territory, you see the light purple territory, by the time of his death. So we're talking about slightly more than a third of the country. So a very, very substantial achievement. Now, Toyotomi Hideyoshi was someone who was a very, very different path to success. He was born a peasant. He became Nobunaga's sandal bearer and favorite supporter. As Nobunaga's successor, he then continued the unification of Japan. Now, Toyotomi Hideyoshi deployed a variety of strategies: diplomacy, marriage alliances, and economic skill. So, like Oda Nobunaga, he wasn't just someone who was skilled with military affairs. He was also someone who was able to bring a variety of skills to the table. Now, Hideyoshi used a series of ruling strategies. One of the things that he did was to send daimyo to different areas to separate them from their power bases. So he would take people and move them to different areas, but the idea being, of course, they didn't know anybody, and it would be harder for them to rebel against him. This, of course, is then a method that later on the final warrior government in Japanese history also used. Another thing that Hideyoshi did was something called the sword hunt, where he made peasants give up their weapons in order to melt them down and build Buddhist statue. And this, of course, had a couple of purposes. First of all, it was designed to discourage rebellion. Second, it served to clearly distinguish the warriors from peasants. So that's significant because, of course, it set the precedent that warriors are the only ones who are allowed to be armed, and everybody else is not supposed to be. This was then further cemented by the Separation Edict in 1591, where there were clear distinctions made between the warrior, artisan, merchant, and peasant classes, and there was a prohibition made where people weren't allowed to change class. So this served to cripple social mobility. Now, this is particularly significant because this is something that's often held up as a product of the Edo period. This strict class system that's set up where people aren't supposed to move from one class to the other, and the warriors are at the top of society, and only the warriors are allowed to have swords. And yet clearly we find that the roots of this are actually in Hideyoshi's strategies rather than something that was developed later on. So that is something that's particularly significant to think about from that point of view. Now, the irony of this, of course, is that had this system been in effect from the beginning, there is no way that someone like Hideyoshi, who you might recall peasant background, could have worked his way up to become the Lord of the Realm. He's able to do this precisely because such a kind of system was not in place. It's almost as if the moment he actually crawled his way up to the very top of Japanese society, Hideyoshi turns around and decides that he wants to stop anyone else from ever doing the same thing. Well, he didn't just have his series of ruling strategies, he also effectively made use of his economic power. One of the things he did was deploy cadastral surveys, which enabled him to reform the tax system. He also had a lot of income from gold and silver mines. He continued to draw on domestic and foreign trade. And he also used a lot of this wealth rather than just saving it up. He built castles, he held these great cultural events, especially tea ceremonies, and these were all very calculated displays of wealth that were designed to show off and impress people. course, his most famous power center was Osaka Castle. This, of course, is the reconstruction today. Osaka Castle was the center of Hideyoshi's polity, and of course, he carried out a lot of cultural events there that would sort of cement his image as this ruler of the whole unified country. This is an example of an Oban gold coin minted at Hideyoshi's order in 1588. It weighs 165 grams, and you can see it's quite sizable too, 17 by 10 centimeters. Hideyoshi's large-scale coins were some of the largest historic gold coins ever made. The fact that he even set out to produce these, of course, it wasn't just about economic performance, it was also about this type of display of power involved in making these things. Well, Hideyoshi decided, in the midst of his sort of celebrating himself and building everything up and establishing himself as this great ruler of the unified country, he starts to contemplate the idea of an empire and the possibility that maybe he could subjugate Ming China. This was, of course, a little bit of a stretch. Nevertheless, he tries to carry this out. Well, first of all, of course, it's decided that if Japan is going to invade China, they have to find the best route of attack, and they decide they're going to go through Korea. The Korean kingdom, understandably, is a little bit reluctant and refuses to let the army pass by. Hideyoshi responds by invading. First attempt, 1592 to 1593, initially it's quite successful. We have to keep in mind here that the warriors in Japan are people that have come out of this Sengoku period. They're used to fighting, they're in a very aggressive type of environment, and then they're just being thrown into this foreign country and forcing their way up. Of course, they do have quite a few advantages going for them, but as they reach further north, they get bogged down, and the campaign ends up grinding to a halt. Later on, they try again. There's a second attempt to invade in 1597 to 1598. This too ends in failure. Why were the samurai armies unable to succeed in Korea? Well, there's a few reasons for failure. Three that we can think of right away. One is the success of the Korean admiral, Yi Sun-shin. The Korean admiral was very, very strategically minded. Not only that, he also had a great advantage technologically. He had what were called turtle ships, which were essentially a type of armored vessel. We're not exactly sure how these were made and what exactly they looked like, but the important thing is that they were able to repel fire and arrows. And this gave them a great advantage over the Japanese vessels, but couldn't compete with that. This is important because the further in Korea that the Japanese armies got, the harder it was to supply them from the Japanese islands. And every time they tried to send out supply missions, of course, the Korean admiral could sink their ships. So this ended up causing a massive problem. So this was one of the main factors involved in their failure. Another was, of course, the Korean guerrilla resistance. Even as the Japanese armies were able to gain more ground working their way up to the north, of course the Koreans continued to fight back even in the territory they controlled. And of course China itself got directly involved in the conflict as well, which also tipped the scales decisively against Japan. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, naturally the invasion got called off and the Japanese forces returned back to the Japanese islands. There has been a lot of debate concerning this invasion and why Hideyoshi let this go ahead, particularly because taking on the Imperial Chinese army does not seem like a great recipe for success. There have been a variety of explanations offered, the possibility that perhaps in his old age Hideyoshi was losing his mind, the possibility that perhaps he never really meant to succeed and was just trying to burn off a lot of the energy of all of these warriors because it's better to have them dying in a foreign country than standing around plotting rebellion. But however way you look at it, it was a miserable failure and it ended up being all called off the moment that Hideyoshi passed away. Third unifier, Tokugawa Ieyasu, another major influential warlord, a vassal of Nobunaga and then Hideyoshi after him. Tokugawa Ieyasu always had a reputation for something of a plotter. He was someone who thought very far ahead, made very long-term strategic decisions. Right from the start, Oda and Toyotomi Hideyoshi suspected that Tokugawa Ieyasu might be a threat in the future if he wasn't carefully controlled. In fact, Hideyoshi married his sister to Ieyasu at one point in an attempt to control him. Ieyasu was known for being a very cautious strategist. He didn't like to put a lot of stock in just military might, liked to plan carefully, liked clever tricks, anything he could do to get an advantage. He developed the Kanto region into a military and economic powerhouse. Of course, later on, this went to lay the foundation for the center of the military government that he set up, which gave us, of course, the groundwork for the area of Tokyo today. Now, when Hideyoshi passed away, Ieyasu had sworn to be loyal to Hideyoshi's son Hideyori, but he quickly planned to dominate and take over himself. The struggle between his faction and his enemies eventually led to a great battle in 1600, the Battle of Sekigahara. And this saw a conflict between the Eastern Army, Tokugawa Ieyasu and his allies, and the Western Army, the Toyotomi family, and the others with them. Now, the Western Army at the start of the battle actually had a numerical and tactical advantage, and in fact Ieyasu had said before the battle that he didn't think his chances of winning were very high. Nevertheless, he had arranged to try and reward defectors, and he was hoping that people would switch sides and back him during the battle. When this happened, this changed the tide of the battle, and the advantage quickly went to his side. The Western side got very confused, and they ended up retreating in a chaotic mess. So they went from having an advantage to being overrun. So this is an artistic depiction of the battle. There are, of course, many of these. This is one of the major turning points in Japanese history, because from this point on, Tokugawa Ieyasu is clear to establish his own military government and assert control instead of the Toyotomi. So, total victory for Tokugawa results. He forms a new Bakufu in 1603. Of course, the Toyotomi are not quite yet gotten rid of. Hideyori has sealed himself in Osaka Castle and has built up a very strong group of defenders, and it takes Tokugawa Ieyasu quite some time to defeat him. Eventually, he destroys the defenders at Osaka Castle and removes the last possibility of there being any opposition to Tokugawa rule. Consequently, his new system, which incorporates elements from Nobunaga's and Hideyoshi's policies, then is firmly established, and it goes on to rule Japan for the next 250 years. So, clearly, unifying Japan after more than a century of war was a very slow and complex process. The three unifiers were successful due to many factors, and it wasn't just military skill. We also see that they deployed long-term strategy, diplomacy, trade, intrigue. But the end of the unification period clearly shows one individual dominating Japan in an unparalleled fashion. There had never been someone before in Japanese history with that amount of direct, focused power, particularly backed up by military strength. So this heralds the transition from medieval Japan into early modern Japan, which is where we will pick up in a future version of this course. Thank you very much.